In 1991, Tracy Edwards ran out of the Milwaukee Oxford Apartments in clear distress as he alerted the attention of two cops. As the officers tried to make sense of what the man had seen or done, they noticed the handcuffs that dangled from Tracy's wrist. They followed Tracy's steps back to the apartment complex and found themselves in front of room 213. When the door opened, a man answered calmly and said he'd get the keys to Tracy's handcuffs. One of the officers stepped into the room with Tracy's claim that the man who rented the space threatened him prior. As an officer surveyed his surroundings, he came across a drawer full of Polaroid photographs that contained corpses and dismembered bodies. Jeffrey Dahmer, the man that threatened Tracy Edwards, was arrested shortly after. Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer and sex offender who was active between 1978 and 1991. He was responsible for the murders of 17 young men in Milwaukee before he was arrested and murdered in prison. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in West Allis, Wisconsin, the son of Joyce and Lionel Dahmer. While Joyce was pregnant with Jeffrey, she reportedly took up to 27 pills a day, some of which included antidepressants. Her difficulties during pregnancy did not cease the young Dahmer's happiness, who was a very joyful child at an early age. However, Jeffrey had a double hernia surgery at 4 that turned the once energetic child into a quiet, reclusive one. It was accordingly due to Jeffrey believing his genitals had been cut off during it, this theory further referencing to his murders where he would cut off some of his victims' penises. He fell further into this behavior after his brother David was born when he was 7. The family moved to Bath, Ohio, where Jeffrey seemed unable to find much interest in common hobbies. He was still reportedly very introverted, and his father Lionel found aspects in his behavior that struck him as odd. As Jeffrey entered high school, he became fond of roadkill and playing with various acids and substances. All of these interests were supposedly brought to his attention by his father, who was a chemist at the time. These hobbies that could have been considered normal in other contexts blew out of proportion when it began affecting Jeffrey and his lifestyle and thoughts. Almost always absorbed with bones and animal flesh, it filled his mind almost on a daily basis because he appeared too unbothered to think about much else. During high school, he made very little friends and hardly interacted with anyone. He was reportedly very shy and could not do very well when getting along with his peers. Although his performance was average, he was not in the right state of mind and emotion. He'd started drinking copious amounts of alcohol and even did so during school. Around this time, he was developing unhealthy thoughts about death and the roadkill he would dissect, specifically fantasies that involved dead bodies or other parts. Supposedly, he would drink to push down these thoughts, but it affected him greatly. During the forming of these thoughts, he also started to realize that he was gay. This could have been talked about in order to get rid of any conflict that Jeffrey carried surrounding his sexuality, but being in high school at this time had made it rough for him to even come out. Life at home wasn't much better, as his parents had finalized their divorce after many fights. Neither parent were there for Dahmer much because they were too busy dealing with their personal issues to notice their son's problems. Jeffrey was disoriented almost all the time and didn't have much of an outlet or a proper space to express the thoughts that were in his head, except for beer. After high school, Jeffrey went to Ohio State University but ended up dropping out after 2 semesters due to his drinking problems. Roughly before this time, when he was 18 years old, Jeffrey murdered Stephen Hicks in cold blood. While driving around town, Jeffrey came across 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks. The latter asked for a ride to a rock concert when Dahmer offered. Instead of taking him there, he drove them back to his house and they chatted over beer. When Stephen Hicks was clearly intoxicated and tried to leave, Jeffrey dropped a barbell on his head while he was turned away and strangled him until he died. He dismembered the body and had gotten rid of it shortly after. Following Stephen's murder, Dahmer enlisted in the army for a few years before getting kicked due to his drinking problems. Until his arrest in 1991, Jeffrey killed 16 more men whose ages ranged from 14 to 31. There was no real or definite answer as to why Jeffrey committed these atrocities, but some have speculated it was due to his inability to form normal romantic relationships or his abandonment issues. And personally, while I agree with those factors, I don't think there is just one that played into why he did what he did. I think that every little stressor played into why he did it. So, after all these years, how did people, mostly the media, how did we respond to this crime? How do we respond to a murderer, and what do people think of it now, even after so long? With a quick Google search on the headlines that erupted after Dahmer's arrest, we get things like "A Loner's Morbid Fascination" or "Little Body Shop of Horrors." Nicknames like the Milwaukee Cannibal or Monster were hung over Jeffrey's head. At first glance, headlines like these may have incited some type of fear in a normal audience, fear that would turn into fascination. What people don't realize is how silly-sounding headlines, like mentioned, can heavily shift society's perspective on something serious into something almost fictitious. People didn't view Dahmer as a murderer, but as a quiet and scary man who carefully calculated each of his murders and getaways from the cops. Why do we get headlines like these? Why are people still interested in this case years later? The media is extremely influential on these things, whether we are able to notice it or not. Journalists and writers at this time did anything they could to pump out over-dramatized details about Dahmer's case, and bizarre diagnoses that would point him to psychopathy. Here's an example of a headline that was published around the time Jeffrey was arrested, and it says, "Face of madman who killed 17 and ate them." In the headline there, though it's kind of chopped off, it says "The Cannibal," and it features a full headshot of Jeffrey Dahmer. This was all for the sole reason of garnering a large enough audience and lure them into a fear of a man who was hardly memorable. The media profited off the murders of the victims, usually only referring to them when they would talk about how Jeffrey would eat their body parts. Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes manifested as a result of childhood neglect and emotional abuse due to the absence of a healthy space where he could receive support for his thoughts. But these are factors that should not justify his murders. When we inform people about cases like these, we acknowledge the facts and conclude with the crime, and there really is no other purpose to drag it out with exaggeration. An example of the media's portrayal of Jeffrey's crimes dates back to a few months before Dahmer was arrested. The film Silence of the Lambs was released and featured a cannibal as the antagonist. When people began connecting the real-life murderer Jeffrey to the movie Cannibal, everything began to focus on the gritty details of what he did to his victims and the idea of cannibalism itself. Not only did this content dehumanize Jeffrey Dahmer, but it most importantly drew attention away from the victims and families that truly suffered. Now, how do people view Dahmer's case years after his death in prison? We have gotten many films and many books. One of the most notable movies is My Friend Dahmer, a take on Jeffrey's early life where he is played by Disney star Ross Lynch. I also have a physical copy of the book that the movie was based on, and it was written by Durf, who was a friend who wasn't necessarily close to Jeffrey Dahmer in high school, but he knew him, and he wrote this about him. A lot of the movies I've watched have contained some type of murder sequence that has included Jeffrey in a blue barrel. Most of it are inaccurate depictions of the murders he carried out. Upon searching up his name and looking under the shopping tab, we see shirts of Jeffrey's face in cartoonish colors, usually decorated with the quote, "I've got to start eating at home more." So, what is the whole point of a few shirts and a few trinkets of a serial killer? The point is of how easily swayed we as people can be when it comes to media exposure. The human mind is so complex that when we encounter someone or something that is foreign to us, we don't stray away in fear. Based on what we've seen in Dahmer's case, we are attracted to the unknown and are curious to find the meanings behind every bit of controversy, even when it is so abnormally morbid and should be consumed in an informational way. The way we view and immerse ourselves into content like this is not necessarily unhealthy, but it is important to remind ourselves of the real victims. It is so much better to pay respect to the families than to a man we will never know personally.